food, if
Let's
we
do
sleep
this.
well, if we exercise, not a lot of waste products will be produced in our
You did
body.
something,
Of
didn't
course,
you?
I'm simplifying it very much, but that is the idea behind why lifestyle is profoundly important for prevention of Alzheimer's disease.
Well, Nourish and others have proven that lifestyle is profoundly important with heart disease. Aisha, you are a vascular neurologist. I think of the brain as amazingly vascular, just suffused with blood vessels. And Nourish and others have demonstrated that a fairly low-fat, whole foods, plant-based diet, along with other simple lifestyle practices, such as getting regular exercise, could prevent the vast majority of heart attacks and other major adverse heart events, and can in fact reverse even advanced heart disease. Aisha, is there something similar going on with brain health as there is with heart health?
There most certainly is, yes. The vascular theory of Alzheimer's disease has been ignored. It was something that was thought of as completely separate. For the last few decades, research on Alzheimer's disease always focused on the abnormal proteins that were involved in the disease process, amyloid beta protein, tau protein, etc. But now we know that there is a lot of overlap in vascular diseases of the brain and development of Alzheimer's disease. The vessels, the millions and millions of tributaries of these tiny small little vessels that supply oxygen and nutrition to very crucial parts of our brain, if they're not healthy, then the process of deposition of abnormal protein is significantly increased. As far as protection of these vessels are concerned, yes, the same theory of a heart-healthy diet or a heart-healthy lifestyle applies to the brain as well. And when you look at the research done on nutrition, a food pattern that is not necessarily low in total fat, but has good fats in them, and there's reduction of bad fats, so more poly and monounsaturated fats and less
You did
saturated.
6 months of taking an omega-3 supplement, participants had improved cognitive function, they had less brain shrinkage, and they had better brain structures. And this benefit was found to be particularly striking in older adults. So what's your view on the importance of omega-3 fats in brain health and in the development of Alzheimer's disease?
The conversation has always been about the fact that the brain is a fatty organ and therefore it needs fat. That's the mentality. But reality is, yes, it is 60% fat and it has requirements for fat, but the only requirement it has is omega-3. Brain does not have stored fat. There's no storage fat in the brain. It's all structural, and all that structural comes from the kind of fat that it produces, the body produces. It has no lack of fat that the brain can use. That's never been a problem. It's omega-3. The limiting factor is omega-3, and definitely omega-3 is a very, very, very important factor. And we think that it's an important factor throughout life, but especially at the two ends of life, during the development, which is pre-birth, birth, and all the way to early 20s, and then later in life. We've done two comprehensive reviews that are submitted and accepted that should be published fairly soon. One on omega-3 in the developing brain, and another one on omega-3 in the aging brain. And because studying this subject matter is very difficult, in science we go with patterns. The pattern that we got at the end of both of them was that there's more data to show that taking omega-3 or being hyper aware of your omega-3 content in your food is extremely important for your brain health. It wasn't just a couple of papers, but repeatedly we saw the pattern. Now, how you get that omega-3 is up to you. You can get it through pills, and by the way, we're not those that are against people taking omega-3, algae-based omega-3 vitamins. But if you want to get it through food, yes. If it's from chia and flaxseed, then you have to have some precautions, meaning that you have to eat a little more than you thought, and making sure that you don't have a lot of omega-6 foods in your diet, because there's the enzyme that converts ALA to EPA and DHA is one that's common to both pathways, so it can get overwhelmed quickly. And don't drink and don't overwhelm your liver, which does a lot of the work. And if you do that, you'll be fine. But be aware of omega-3 because it's so important.
Well, we've been talking about fats, and we know that the brain uses fats continuously in the process of rebuilding cells and other support structures. Nuts and seeds and olives and avocados are all very high in fat, and consumption of these forms of fat is clearly associated with a lower risk for Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. Would you say then that nuts and seeds and avocados and olives are the kinds of fats you recommend people eat?
The answer is a little complicated, and it's important that it is complicated. So, whenever we talk about fat, even so-called good fat, it has to be in the context of calories. It has to be in the context of other diseases like hypercholesterolemia and other things. And the same story, once we speak about it, the same for coffee and other foods as well. I think we're in the age of complexity, where we have to accept the complexity. So, if somebody has difficulty with weight and calories, they should be extra aware of that, because these fats they pack a load of calories, so be aware of that. But outside of that, those are the kind of fats that people can have and consume with their food, which would be amazing.
You mentioned coffee just now, and in your book you have a fascinating list of what you call the top 20 brain nourishing foods, and one of them is coffee. Now, a lot of people enjoy the caffeine buzz and the daily morning ritual of a cup of freshly brewed hot coffee, and I'm one of those people. In fact, some of us would have a hard time starting our days without it, and we have no trouble seeing the short-term benefits of coffee. Is there something about coffee, though, that makes it healthy long-term for the brain?
Yes, I love my cup of coffee in the morning, and that was good news. I'm happy to report for our coffee lover audience that the studies have actually shown that consumption of some coffee could reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease and some other neurodegenerative disorders, including Parkinson's disease. There was a review of, I believe, 11 observational studies that looked at 29,000 people that found that coffee consumption was associated with lower risk of Alzheimer's disease, and there was a similar study for Parkinson's as well. So we do have data. As far as the amount is concerned, there have been mixed results. There are some studies that suggest not more than 1 cup, and then there was a recent one that showed about 3 to 4 cups of coffee reducing the risk of Alzheimer's disease as well. So we're not very sure about the amount, but I think a cup or 2 wouldn't hurt. And it's because of the potent antioxidants in coffee that actually fight, oxidative free radicals, or these chemicals that actually destroy the coverings of the nerves and the connections between the neurons. That seems to be quite helpful. And obviously, drinking coffee in the context of a healthy diet matters, because if you're drinking coffee and a donut next to it, forget about it. You're not going to benefit from that coffee.
Right, yeah, I understand that, certainly. If it's the antioxidants in coffee that are beneficial to the brain, not the caffeine, then decaffeinated coffee would be just as good. Is that true?
That's true, yes. I think the caffeine part, the adenosine part gives one, that jolt of energy and that, the wakefulness, but it's essentially the antioxidants that seem to have longer, more salutary health effects.
Well, another food on your list of top brain nourishing foods that I found surprising to be there and delighted to find it there was dark chocolate. And now, obviously, most commercial chocolate is full of unhealthy ingredients, too much sugar, dairy products, synthetic chemicals, flavorings. I mean, it's a disaster. But chocolate in its natural form is high in flavonoids, it's loaded with antioxidants, it's full of fiber, it's rich in minerals. It contains substances that increase serotonin and dopamine in the brain. I've seen studies that suggest that people who eat dark chocolate have a lower risk of strokes.
I'm happy to report that there is something in chocolate that is quite beneficial for our arteries. And it's just really, that makes me happy, because I love dark chocolate. And like you said, you mentioned the list of the compounds that are found in chocolate, and flavonoids being one of them. These are such incredible compounds that when we consume them, our arteries essentially relax, and it kind of allows blood to flow to our organs, including the brain. And yes, there have been studies that have looked at the risk of stroke and chocolate, and there's significant reduction in the risk. As a matter of fact, one of the things that we tell our patients and in our communities is buying some cocoa or cacao powder, raw cacao powder, and making a drink from it on a daily basis, or even mixing it with coffee to get its benefit. It's such a wonderful thing.
And you were talking about dopamine and serotonin. So dopamine, the chemical of intention, and serotonin, the chemical of base emotion, are both significantly increased with dark chocolate, as much as having sex. I mean, that's weird to say, but it appears that they are very, very powerful stimulants of those two hormones. And there's very little that does that kind of a beneficial effect. So whenever we say something like this, they just take the dark chocolate side and forget about what kind, what vessel, what context, what other things that go with it, because finding the real pure dark chocolate without sugar added and everything else added is difficult. So we're talking about that difficult item that you have to find, and that has all those benefits. A great deal, if not majority, of the things we see in the shelves are not that thing. So I want to make sure that we don't open the door to all these other chocolates that are usually quite harmful.
Do you have any shopping tips for choosing chocolate products that will be beneficial?
Oh, do you have an hour? Aisha is ready for you.
Okay.
Well, I personally love cacao powder, and the reason I love it is because you can control the amount, and I really like making cocoa chia pudding. So it's a chia pudding with some almond milk and 1 or 2 tablespoons, yes, 1 or 2 tablespoons of dark cacao powder, depending on how intense you can tolerate. I love it when it's intense. And you can even feel the polyphenols and the flavonols and the catechins going through your arteries. So I personally like that. But there are some really good brands. I don't remember them from the top of my head, but there's some good brands that are actually made with a little bit of stevia or maybe some monk fruit, which are non-calorie sweeteners, and those are good too.
Well, your list of the top brain nourishing foods also includes blueberries, and blueberries in particular have gotten a lot of press as brain nourishing foods. I'm thinking of a study published in the Annals of Neurology where researchers analyzed data from 16,000 women with an average age of 74. And they found that the women with the highest levels of blueberry consumption delayed their cognitive aging by 2.5 years. And other studies have found that even common strawberries have enormous benefits for brain health.
Yes, and the data, is repeated in multiple different communities as well. These humble little berries, they are incredible, powerful foods, and we have found them to be helpful fighting against inflammation and oxidation that we see in Alzheimer's disease and stroke and Parkinson's disease, even in cancer. So the study that you mentioned did show that people actually had better looking brain and better functioning brain if berries were consumed. And it's not a lot. You just have to consume at least, half a cup of berries every day to get to that level, which is such empowering news, don't you think?
I really do. I agree with you about that. And are frozen berries just as good?
Yes, absolutely. As a matter of fact, sometimes frozen berries are better than fresh ones because they're picked at their peak ripeness. And if one can find organic wild blueberries, which are actually found in multiple different grocery stores, those are my favorite, and I think they have the highest amount of antioxidants.
Well, that is good to know. Your list of great foods for the brain also includes greens. Researchers at Rush University in Chicago assessed the diet and the mental function of about 1,000 elderly people, and they adjusted for variables such as education and exercise and family history of dementia. They found that those who regularly ate leafy green vegetables, things like spinach and kale, experienced massively less cognitive decline than those who didn't. Now, I'm a huge fan of eating greens for health, but even I was stunned by the findings of this particular study. One of the researchers stated it was the equivalent, eating greens was the equivalent of being 11 years younger in age in terms of cognitive function. Does any of this surprise you?
Well, when it initially came out, my jaw dropped, but I think it's not surprising at all because when you look at the compounds that are found in green leafy vegetables, you have things like lutein, folate, beta carotene, vitamin K, all these fantastic compounds that fight against inflammation and oxidation, and they essentially provide mechanisms for the brain to get rid of all the garbage byproducts. And so when people eat greens on a regular basis, that's what you're providing for your brain. And it's not even a lot, you don't have to eat like a bucket of leafy greens to get to that level. In that particular study that you quoted, people ate about a cup of raw leafy green vegetables or half a cup of cooked. That's easy to do. That's something that hopefully we can all do. And that significantly slowed the decline in cognition. And yes, wow, 11 years younger. There's no medication, nothing out there that does that. And yet it's in the produce aisle in the grocery store.
Which is just wonderful news. It's so empowering, really, that we don't have to anticipate or look forward, in quotes, to aging as a decline of our cognitive function. We really can take the steps, eat the foods that will give us brain health. And I'm thinking now about mushrooms. I know they are also on your top 20 brain nourishing foods list. What is it about mushrooms that make them beneficial to the brain? And would that be true about common mushrooms like the button mushrooms we see in almost every grocery store? Or is this a product of the medicinal mushrooms like shiitake and turkey tails and lion's manes?
Of course, some are better than others, but reality is it's the antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, and the metabolic stabilizing factors that exist in these foods, especially mushrooms. But to be honest, the thing that stands out the most for me as far as mushrooms is concerned is the fact that its texture allows it to be so malleable and so incredibly useful for taste transference. To me, it's one of the best things that I've experienced since I've given up eating meat. It has actually given me the texture that I might have missed. It is so flexible. It is so useful. It can acquire so many tastes. It can acquire so many shapes. It's almost like a shape-shifting produce. It's the ultimate produce that has so many different shapes to begin with and so many different textures to begin with, and then can change into anything else you want it to change into. That's what makes mushrooms remarkable, besides their anti-inflammatory, antioxidant characteristics. I can tell you that Aisha can pretty much make anything out of these mushrooms.
Well, Aisha, what would be an example of a recipe or something you might prepare using mushrooms that you particularly love?
Oh goodness. Let's just talk about last week. We made some oyster mushroom shawarmas. So we marinated oyster mushroom in lots of spices, including paprika, turmeric, and cumin. And I had some herbs as well with a little bit of cayenne pepper. And I let it marinate, and it has this amazing characteristic of absorbing any flavor that you surround it with. And so right after that, we sauteed it in a little bit of extra virgin olive oil very quickly and wrapped it in some greens. And I had made some almond yogurt and we drizzled that on top. And the almond yogurt had some mint and cucumbers and garlic and whatnot. And it was just so good. It was incredibly delicious. The kids love portobello mushrooms, so we take whole portobello mushrooms and we marinate them in herbs and balsamic vinegar and a quick bake with a little bit of cashew mozzarella cheese and some bell peppers on top of it. It's just delicious. Yeah, we eat mushrooms a lot of times, and there are different recipes that we use, but those are our favorite, I think.
Amazing.
Right?
Amazing.
It sounds just delicious. I want to ask you about salt. We know that too much salt can lead to high blood pressure, which is closely associated with both vascular dementia and Alzheimer's, as well as other types of brain diseases, including strokes. We know also that too much salt impairs cerebral blood flow and can damage the blood vessels leading to the brain. So, for optimal brain health, how much salt, if any, should we consume?
So this is very important. I'll take a little bit of time to explain that. Research has shown that high levels of dietary salt causes chemical changes in our body and including in our brain. It actually promotes the abnormal protein deposition in the brain, especially with tau protein. and it can actually feed the clumping or the phosphorylation of tau in the brain. And we know how it damages the arteries in the brain as well. So as a nation, we eat so much salt that I don't think it would be appropriate to actually talk about too little salt. I don't think there's anyone in this country, in the United States, I'm just going to speak about USA, that consumes too little salt. If there is any particular micronutrient that we get from salt, we get it from other substances in our, in our foods, from plants, fruits, nuts, seeds, etc. And so reducing salt as much as possible is incredibly important. The one factor that is critical is iodine. If iodized salt is the type of salt that most people consume, cutting it completely reduces the amount of iodine that we consume. So it's critical for them to be aware of it and consume it in other forms, such as maybe a multivitamin, or maybe potentially just having some seaweeds to be added to their food to include iodine in their diet. But I would say cutting salt as much as possible and flavoring food with herbs and spices is important.
Well, thank you for that. And herbs and spices really do have medicinal as well as culinary benefits. You've seen a lot of people switch to a whole foods plant-strong diet that is rich in the essential nutrients that the brain needs for its optimal functioning. And in doing this, as you make clear, these people are dramatically reducing their risk for almost all forms of dementia. Preventing Alzheimer's is a profound thing, but it's a long-term goal. In the short term, have you seen these kinds of dietary changes to have an effect on things like cognitive functioning and emotional resilience? And if so, how long does it typically take for people to start experiencing these kinds of benefits once they start eating a healthy diet?
In fact, we see that a lot more commonly. People respond rather quickly. Of course, much of that depends on their premorbid state, their baseline state, if they had significant cognitive decline to begin with, or they had other diseases. But in general, we see an effect almost immediately, within weeks to months, of people becoming more alert, more awake, more focused, better memories. So I would say that that's actually the more common thing we see in our clinics.
Yes, I agree. The one common statement that we hear over and over again is the cloud has lifted. People feel very confused and discombobulated at times when they have unhealthy diets, whether it's too much processed sugar or bad fats or too little fiber. And once that goes away, they can attend and focus much better.
When you refer to something like brain fog, we know that one of the most common symptoms today of long COVID is brain fog. Since a whole foods plant-strong diet is so healthy for the brain, would you expect to see people following this kind of an eating path to have fewer problems with long COVID?
Most definitely, yes. And we've, this is anecdotal, so we haven't really published it yet. We should, but we've seen how people, when they change their dietary patterns, they actually improve their cognition significantly, or at least it is one of the factors that helps in the healing process. Obviously, it's not just nutrition, it's also exercise, it's sleep patterns, it's stress, but nutrition has a very, very large role in providing the right kind of environment for the brain to heal itself after COVID.
Well, that's empowering to know, particularly these days. You talk a lot about preventing Alzheimer's, and that's hugely important. As anybody who has watched a loved one go through it knows all too well. You also talk about growing our cognitive capacities well into our senior years, not just not becoming cognitively impaired, but actually becoming more cognitively capable. So what I want to ask you is, what is your vision of successful brain aging? Can you give us a sense of what kind of cognitive experience someone might have in their elder years if they have followed your type of protocols and eaten an optimally healthy diet for much of their lives?
We definitely think that people who have lived an optimal life as far as diet and exercise and all these other things that we talk about within the neuro, they can actually not only maintain their cognitive capacity but grow it. We know that ability to think, ability to process, ability to memorize, ability to focus, ability to
30-second break.
make decisions.
Drink water.
These are
All right, let's get back to this.
shooting.
Can heal your body and your world with food. This is Ocean Robbins, and I am joined by my dad
Can you
and
please
colleague,
mute that?
John Robbins, in welcoming our friend and guest, Dr. Monica Agarwal.
Okay, it's too late.
Monica Agarwal, MD, is an
Let me do it
adjunct
next time,
clinical
darling, please. Thank
associate
you.
professor of medicine in the University of Florida Division of Cardiovascular Medicine. In her own life, she's used the latest breakthroughs in understanding of gut health of the microbiome to reverse the symptoms of an advanced form of rheumatoid arthritis. And now she is sharing these same principles with her patients and with the world. Monica is author of Body on Fire, How Inflammation Triggers Chronic Illness and the Tools We Have to Fight It. She was named a Next Generation Innovator by Cardiology Today, and her research has been published in major medical journals such as Journal of American College of Cardiology and American Journal of Medicine. At the University of Florida's Shands Hospital, Monica has instituted a new plant-based menu as well as new discharge education that empowers patients to heal their bodies with diet and lifestyle. So now, Monica, we're so grateful for your powerful work and so excited for this time with you. And now, for the interview, I'm going to hand it over to my dad and colleague,
And our honor, really. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to bring your wisdom to our audience. Many of us, when we're young, tend to believe that we're invincible, but then something happens. In your case, in 2011, you were a highly accomplished cardiologist, you had a thriving practice, you had 3 young kids, you had a commitment to providing the best care for your patients, but then you were diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis. Monica, can you tell us what happened to you?
When I finally got pregnant with my son, I was overjoyed. I literally was walking on water. And because of that, I had 3 kids really in a quick succession. And so I tried to be everything. I tried to be the perfect doctor. I never missed call. I never asked anybody to help. I took only 6 or 8 weeks off per pregnancy, and then I was right back at it. And I was nursing, I was pumping, I was running, I was pureeing baby food in the setting of overstress, sleeping 4 hours, trying to be the perfect at everything and doing too much. The body eventually fails. It can't keep up. And you think you can, as you said, in your 20s, you think that you're invincible, you can do anything, and your body will handle it in your 20s. We used to carry it as a badge of honor, like, pulled an all-nighter, like it was this great thing to not sleep. But I started manifesting joint pain. It started in
Sleep
one joint
is a
in the
feature,
finger.
not
It
a
migrated
bug.
to another, then my shoulders. I remember the glass that used to cut my feet because I used to feel like I couldn't walk. I went from being an active runner to being almost completely immobilized in just a several-week period.
That sounds very, very painful. You referred to it as the body failing. In one way, of course, it is. It's failing to serve the agenda you're living. But at the same time, it's in some other way, it's the body succeeding in getting you to stop doing things that are unsustainable, deeply unsustainable, and giving you an opportunity, in your case, to right the ship and get into balance with yourself. When you were first diagnosed with arthritis, what was the response from your medical team?
So, doctors are terrible patients and we're very stubborn. And when I started manifesting all the joint pain and getting so sick, I decided to treat myself. I treated myself for Lyme disease because I had migratory joint pain. I continued to get worse and not better. I finally had a friend draw labs. I didn't even go see a doctor, just had some friends draw some labs, and all my inflammatory markers were through the roof. And then I went to one of the best rheumatologists in town, and he told me that I had an incurable illness and that it overall, because my markers were so high, that it boded for a poor prognosis overall. He said that I would need to get on medications as soon as possible, and he recommended getting on meds within 1 week of my diagnosis because he was so concerned about the joint destruction that I was going to face.
Did that also mean ceasing nursing your baby?
Yeah, so when he said that to me, he knew I was nursing, and he quickly said, well, you're just gonna have to stop. And I remember that moment so well because I never would want to say something like that to somebody, because it's like the flippant way he said that to me. I remember thinking, wow, okay, that's how it's gonna be. All of a sudden you really feel like the control has been taken from you. And so he told me that I needed to stop nursing, I needed to start medications immediately, so I did. I felt like I had to do what I had to do, and I stopped nursing that day. There are days I remember where the baby would cry for me, and I just had to walk away, and just milk pouring out of me because I couldn't nurse the baby, and probably some of the darkest times for me.
It sounds really painful. And yet, you said that it's not illness that defines us really, but how we respond to it that makes us who we are. What did that mean to you at that time?
Well, at that time, I don't think that I was there. I was, at the time that I got sick, I was a little angry, and I was bitter, and I was tired. I didn't have the foresight or the understanding of what was happening, and just was reactive to what was in front of me, what I was feeling, all the pain, which was significant. The joint pain is really painful. So it took some time to get to that statement that you commented on. I went through a long journey of having to learn, because the medications that I was put on had significant side effects. They made my hair fall out, I had a metallic taste in my mouth, I felt very nauseated all of the time. But then I met a really interesting woman who came to see me for one of my events, and she asked to talk to my patients about nutrition. And I said, I really know a lot about nutrition, I got this, and how wrong I was. And she said, well, let me just do your nutrition profile, let me do you. And I was already vegetarian at the time, but I was sort of a junk food vegetarian. And she started talking to me about dairy and animal products and processed foods. And it started me on this path.
This must have been a very painful and frightening process for you. But I'm glad you had the benefit and the counsel of the woman who steered you away from foods that were inflammatory and were contributing to your illness. Monica, what did you do next?
I went all over the country learning from specialists about gut flora and longevity and telomeres and food and stress and sympathetic tone, and I just ate it up. I couldn't believe how much was out there that as a doctor I didn't know. And it was during this time that I started realizing that there's so much you can do, and I started realizing that the person I was when I got sick, that wasn't who I wanted to be. I didn't want to be this angry, bitter person. I wanted to be somebody who felt empowered and who wanted to change and wanted to get better and would take her life in her own hands. And it was at that point that I learned it is not your illness that defines you, it's how you respond to it. It's like if you fall, it's not how you fall, it's how you get up. You have to learn to heal from your illness. And my illness is probably in some ways the best thing that ever happened to me, because even though it's horrible to get illness and I wouldn't wish that on anyone, it's what changed everything for me. It changed my whole outlook on life and on how I take care of my health, on how I raise my children and teach them how to eat, and how I work with patients.
I've often thought how medical training doesn't teach the power of nutrition to prevent disease, to reverse disease, to build health. It's kind of just left out of the curriculum. And nutritional education and the lack of it in medical schools is one of the things we're trying to change. One of the things that struck me when I read your new book is that you write that you feel healthier now than you did before you were diagnosed with the arthritis. Now your cholesterol is super low, your inflammatory markers, which as you said earlier were through the roof, are virtually non-existent. You don't take any of the meds that you needed to take to control the arthritic symptoms, but which were having all these serious side effects. You basically feel great. You do triathlons on the feet that used to feel like they were walking on glass. Monica, what did you do that turned things around for you so fabulously?
Boy, what didn't I do? I changed everything. I learned the value of sleep, which was a huge one for me, which, I felt guilty at first. And how funny is that you feel guilty sleeping because you think that you should be doing other things, taking care of your kids, doing this, reading that journal,
Sleep.
all the things that we
REM
put
sleep.
so much pressure on
Huge
ourselves.
part of
So I changed everything.
Health.
I started sleeping more. I changed my diet
rest.
completely.
Body
And we
needs
can
rest
talk about that for
to
sure.
repair.
I started doing yoga. I slowed down my running because I used to run so much and arguably too much. I started learning to calm my mind. I learned all about stress and the importance and impact of stresses on the body. And when people think of stress, typically they think of, emotional stress or work stress. But there's so many stresses on the body, aren't there? And all of what you eat, the processed foods, the environmental stress or noise, those are all stresses on your body. And, we're so good at charging our phones, that we go and we run when we have 7%, we panic because our phone is going to die, and then we put it in the charger so we can recover. But we've lost and forgotten how to recover our bodies. So we allow our bodies to have all this stress all of the time, and we don't give ourselves that time to recover. And it's that imbalance that is the trigger of so much illness. So that's what I needed to learn. I had to learn to slow down and learn to say it's okay. And I started eating very clean. I cut out all sorts of processed foods. Dairy is highly inflammatory, and I cut out all of my dairy products. And I haven't had dairy in 9-10 years now, and haven't looked back.
When you say that dairy is highly inflammatory, I want to talk with you a little bit about chronic inflammation. When acute inflammation occurs, it's often a response to an injury or to an infection,
This is
and it
it.
has a positive role to play.
Stretch,
But
baby.
with chronic inflammation, it's a different story.
Good job.
For example, if inflammatory